this is really the first of a conference of this kind. There have been single-issue conferences focusing, for example, on regulation, deregulation, market economics. This conference approaches it from many angles, based on the work of many years of scholars and activists and people who engage in both endeavors, as we will see throughout the day. Also welcome C-SPAN and Real News Network out of Baltimore, who are conveying the proceedings to a larger audience. We expect to produce a volume from the papers submitted here, and also turn the material into a variety of media interfaces. It's important to know that free market mythology is a basic educational tool in this country, where the chambers of commerce, for example, go right into the middle schools and teach what isn't so. They teach the myths of free markets, which are very hard to find these days, given the prevalence of corporate power. There will be additions to the proceedings here. We invited several other people, Professor Margaret Radin, Professor Lisa Heiserling, on areas dealing with fine print contracts, contracts of adhesion, which Professor Radin calls torts in themselves, that they have become wrongful injuries in their one-sided contract peonage and servitude that all of us have to sign on a dotted line or click on. And also Professor Heiserling taking apart the issues of cost-benefit and how those are twisted to favor corporate power, contrary to any concept of market economics. At the outset, I'd like to thank John Richard and his assistants, Matt Marin and Ethan Weisbaum, who worked on the both substance and logistics of this conference. There are many ways to look at any economy or political economy, as we know. We can look at them the way Edgar Kahn, who was a co-progenitor of legal services for the poor way back in the 1960s, and he's come up with different kinds of markets, what he calls the core economy of the household, which isn't paid for. The volunteer part of the sector produces extremely valuable services, the market economy itself, and the public services or public goods economy. There are other ways to look at the economy, the movement in recent years to redefine progress and change the way GDP yardsticks are measured. Indeed, the controlling process here that implements the myths of market fundamentalism are the yardsticks of progress. And we hear that our economy is booming, but for who? As Professor Daniel Ostis said, it's about distribution, distribution, distribution. We get aggregate data and aggregate yardsticks. We don't get distributional yardsticks when the press releases every so often come out of the government and out of the corporate economic realm. And so, for example, we see yardsticks on corporate profits, corporate capital, some yardsticks on unemployment, but they ignore child poverty, they ignore the poor quality of the economy, the horrific distribution and inequality in the economy, the depreciation of natural resources in the economy, the environmental devastation in the economy, even the huge surge since 1980 of obesity in this country, which is now over 30%, when it was under 10%. in 1980 and all the health consequences of that as a result of massive promotion of fast food full of salt, fat, and sugar at a very young age by the electronic child molesters or marketeers in this area. So the question is, what is market fundamentalism? And the Nobel laureate economist at Columbia, Joe Stiglitz, said that market fundamentalism goes back a long ways, but it was really given a high profile by Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. He says, and I quote him, "From a historical point of view, for a quarter century, the prevailing religion of the West has been market fundamentalism. I say it is a religion because it was not based on economic science or historical evidence. It was sold by Thatcher in the UK and by Reagan in the USA. It made reference to some old ideas in economics, specifically to Adam Smith's notion of the invisible hand, which is the argument that firms who pursue their self-interest and the maximization of profits would lead as if by an invisible hand to general societal well-being. Adam Smith himself was very aware of the limitations of this argument. In fact, he warned very explicitly of the dangers of unfettered markets, but those who advocated this kind of market fundamentalism advocated a particular form of economic organization, profit-maximizing firms without government regulation." This issue of market fundamentalism was also given publicity by George Soros in a critical manner. And so the question is, why is it so important to challenge market fundamentalism? Well, anybody who's been advocating in the consumer, environmental, labor, tax areas understands why. Because whenever these advocacies are put out publicly, the market fundamentalists fire back that the corporations have no control over markets. They have to subject themselves to free market discipline, and that is their legitimacy. That's how they justify even what many people would think their failures, their refusal to sell, their discrimination, their ignoring of basic human needs in the market context. I think it's useful to see how these ideas get currency. Those of us who followed the career of Milton Friedman remember his book, Capitalism and Freedom, came out in 1962 and was given huge and constant publicity by the emerging corporate think tanks as well as by academics. The book was very readable. It was full of plausibility, suffering from empirical malnutrition. And that has been the kind of arguments that have been used, very little empirical base for the arguments. I happened to debate Milton Friedman twice, once in Princeton, once in Pittsburgh, sponsored by conservative Princeton students, and once at the Greenbrier in Virginia, one of these corporate retreats. He indicated something quite interesting. He's best known for his statement that corporations have only one purpose, is to produce profits. And when he was asked after that, well, how about obeying the law? He says, of course, they also have to obey the law. He kept saying that he's against the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. He thinks their demands are outrageous. It leads to government control. And he said he's not pro-business, he's pro-free enterprise, he's pro-free markets. So I posed this to him. I said, you've recommended, Dr. Friedman, abolition of licensure of physicians, that physicians should not be licensed. And what if you had your local butcher see a great opportunity here and put out a sale on heart bypass surgery because there's no license? would you permit that? And he said, well, nothing's worse than the American Medical Association cartel. I said, would you permit that? He said, the free market will discipline, and sooner or later, people won't consider the butcher, because the butcher will have butchered the operation. Reminds us of the Keynesian comment, sooner or later. That's what we're up against. We're up against, during the Kavanaugh hearing, Senator Mike Lee just threw out this. The cost of regulation is $2 trillion. Where does that figure come from? It comes from Murray Wiedenbaum, who started it way back when he went to Washington University in St. Louis after he did a stint with Reagan as on the Council of Economic Advisors. And he came out with a figure of about 150, 200 billion. And we asked him, where'd you get that? He said, well, there's no real good data there, but what I did was I took the budgets of the major regulatory agencies and multiplied by 5. And so year after year, this figure grows, and year after year, there is no effective rebuttal to it. It's seen by progressive economists or a lot of other economists as so absurd that it's not worthy of rebuttal. In the meantime, it's constantly drilled by the political structure of our country and the political allies until it becomes reported by the press as if it's a reality. Now, we all know that there's a difference between small business and big business. I don't think much of the description here is going to relate to small businesses, ma and pa stores that try to compete and never get bailed out. And so I think it's important to use the word corporate capitalism when we discuss market fundamentalism. And in many ways, the structure of fabrications here can be described in a general plane, and that is that they use the free market argument to deter all kinds of activity they don't like, including government, health and safety, regulation, labor standards, and the like. And yet, with every fiber of these giant corporations' being, they work with their corporate attorneys to develop an incredible matrix of controlling markets, monopolizing markets, dissipating markets, getting rid of markets, twisting markets into grotesque impacts on innocent people. And that is what I think we're going to hear a lot about today with the speakers. It's not free trade. That's market fundamentalism. It's corporate managed trade agreements. It's a transnational system of autocratic government that subordinates health, safety, labor, environmental standards to the imperatives of corporate commercial trade, to which these basic values have to adhere and be shaped by. I've pulled together 5 ways that corporations prevaricate in terms of their alleged adherence to free market discipline. And these are 5 principles of capitalism that large corporations violate. The first principle is that owners are supposed to control what they own with some reasonable degree of control. I mean, there's eminent domain and other restrictions, of course. Well, the shareholders, institutional and individual, own the corporations. They are virtually powerless. Their power has been sucked out of their ownership into the hired hands of corporate executives and boards of directors. It has now gone to such an extreme that the business judgment rule almost allows mergers in some cases, bankruptcy decisions in some cases, all kinds of executive compensation to escape any kind of either advisory or mandatory approval by the shareholders. The second, under capitalism, business is supposed to sink or swim. It's supposed to obey the verdict of the marketplace. And we now know from recent experience there are a lot of large companies that are too big to fail, like the Wall Street banks. They demand that Uncle Sam serve as their all-purpose protector, providing a variety of public guarantees and emergency bailouts. Capitalism, number 3, is supposed to exhibit a consensual freedom of contract. You can't have market economics without freedom of contract. 99% of all contracts we'll ever sign are fine print contracts. We sign on the dotted line, no amendments, and we click on, and often never even see any part of the contract. Freedom of contract has been destroyed. And it's remarkable how little this argument is used against the market fundamentalists. That is their principal Achilles heel, because it's understood by every American, without exception, who has to sign on the dotted line and then be very surprised at the rights that they have given up on page 18 in the fine print. The Airbnb contract, for example, is over 60 pages of fine print. And many of these contracts include unilateral modification, which is the exact opposite of the meeting of the minds and contractual consent, as well as compulsory arbitration and exclusion from having their day in court, consumers, and trial by jury. A power upheld by all too many right-wing judges, and a power that no government can impose on us. No government can block us from using the 7th Amendment to have our day in court, but corporations can. The fourth is capitalism requires a framework of law and order. Adam Smith, John Locke, Frederick Hayek, and Milton Friedman all understood this necessity. And these are rules of economic fair play needed to prevent mayhem, fraud, deception, predatory practices. And only those caught in positions of extreme dereliction, like Enron, ever have reason to expect more than a transferable slap on the wrist for violating legal mandates. Fifth and finally, capitalist enterprises are expected to compete on an even playing field. That is a laughable prevarication in the world of giant corporatism. Corporate lobbyists, starting with their abundant cash for political campaigns, have developed a corporate state where governments lavish many subsidies on big business while denying comparable benefits to individuals and family business. We have a government of big business, by big business, for big business. The use of the tax system is another technique to disadvantage small business and severely tilt the playing field. We have today really tremendous array of experts who are going to deliver their considered expertise, which they have honed over the years, both in the field of action and in the field of thought, and do so in a way that provides more laser beams on the myths of market fundamentalism and how free market ideology is used to justify the worst behaviors of these global corporations. I remember the head of Intel testifying before the Senate a few years ago, desperately asking for a renewal of the free research and development funds to sustain Silicon Valley, saying, we're not very good at basic research. These very profitable companies like Cisco, Intel, Apple, and Facebook, and so on. But we're very good in applied research. But you must continue to spend taxpayer money for that purpose. And indeed, where would these corporations be without the FDIC, which they like, Where would they be between agribusiness research and development by Department of Agriculture, which they heavily rely on? Where would they be without the infrastructure that makes their private sales possible? Where would they be in dozens of areas where the government is filling the huge gaps unmet by markets? There are huge piles of capital that are not looking for investment. Trillions of dollars held abroad by U.S. corporations and in this country. Nobody would have predicted 30, 40 years ago, when the capital formation shortage was a big issue here in Washington, that they would have so much capital that they wouldn't know what to do with it, because management was so inept that they didn't know how to find new investment, worker training, higher salaries, shoring up pension funds, doing R&D, and even engaging in acquisitions. Instead, they're using $6 to $7 trillion, as we'll see, in stock buybacks since 2005, a totally unproductive use of capital. And so we have these mutations where corporate capitalism goes way off the foreseeability and the prediction of market scholars. Huge piles of capital, while there are huge unmet needs in this country. Unmet needs that are called redlining, that are called 30 million unbanked Americans here. And yet, the market fundamentalists and their prevarications, willing to take the FDIC guarantee and other guarantees of banks too big to fail, are opposing postal savings systems, are opposing public banking systems, even though they have refused to deal with tens of millions of people's banking needs. I'm talking about institutionalizing lawlessness, systemically subverting markets. And the articles I've written on this are on the Harvard Law Record website. So you go to hlrecord.org, hlrecord.org, and you'll get the 3 articles are working. And you'll also learn about Pete Davis's report as a third-year law student last year on changing Harvard Law School's priorities from producing overwhelmingly corporate lawyers to start producing lawyers who represent the rest of the people in the country, as befits the motto of Harvard Law School, which is not properly observed, which is to develop leaders in justice in our country. The first thing I want to say is law is always in a collision with raw power. I mean, the whole purpose of law is to restrain, direct, and reshape power so that it observes important values in society that we often summarize as justice. And corporate power in the last 30, 40 years, so much of this started with Ronald Reagan, this drop from the 60s and 70s in attentiveness to the necessities of the people. Corporate power is running roughshod over the rule of law. And where it isn't running roughshod over the rule of law and violating it with systemic lawlessness, it is enacting the laws that exempt them from behaving properly. These are not just loopholes, there are all kinds of laws, health and safety laws, where the corporate lobby has gone up to Congress and cut out the criminal penalty. So even if they willfully, knowingly violate auto safety standards that kill people, they can't be prosecuted criminally because they got the criminal law provision that we were fighting for in 1966 cut out of the legislation in Congress before it was sent to Lyndon Johnson for signing. And so they are still behaving criminologically, but not technically criminal because they reshaped the law to give them immunity and impunity. Just very, very briefly, I wrote this article called Harvard Lawlessness School and You. So this is the Harvard Law School students, that there should be a split in the curriculum where the traditional law school curriculum, they talk about statutes and judicial decisions and how things are supposed to be, with a little criticism once in a while of the judges or the statutes to sharpen their acuity. But they almost never study mass lawlessness. Like, it's very hard to find much curriculum on corporate crime. When I was in law school, there was no curriculum on corporate crime. It didn't exist as part of the curriculum, even though it existed everywhere. Landlords against tenants, drug companies against consumers, auto companies against auto buyers, etc. Which shows you that the determinant of a law school curriculum, and this could be applied to accounting school curriculum, are the job market. And the job market is not representing lucratively ordinary people, it's representing corporations. So here's how and the government is no exception to this. Lawlessness is in the government. Look what's happening in the EPA now under Trump. They are systematically violating congressional mandates in pesticide control and control of emissions from the coal industry and other mercury releases. They are stripping with impunity on behalf of their corporate paymasters and future employers. They are stripping the mandates of Congress. They are violating the law in the guise of prosecutorial discretion or law enforcement. This is not prosecutorial discretion. This is stripping budgets, firing scientists, not enforcing the law, pulling back litigation that's maturing in courts, letting student loan rackets off the hook and so on. But here's something that law schools don't even spend much time on. Look at the national security state. Our national security government has given us, just imagine, this is in the USA, land of the free, home of the brave, rule of law, U.S. Constitution. Here's what they've given us: secret wars, secret law, secret courts, secret evidence, secret prisons, unauthorized secret budgets, unlawful surveillance of attorney-client communications, snooping, blatant snooping on all Americans in violation of the Fourth Amendment, and unauditable secret expenditures for quagmires abroad, and even, this should shock law professors, redacted published judicial decisions. So they open up these judicial decisions in case books or in research for the law students, and they got whole lines blacked out. Unheard of years ago. These are public appellate judicial decisions. What's next? The corporations, with the brilliant architecture of corporate law firms, whatever you say about corporate lawyers, they are really brilliant in concentrating power and brokering for their corporate clients all kinds of nefarious and harmful activities. In fact, just in an hour of listing, I listed 25 areas that corporate lawyers representing companies that they're not going to look back on with pride. Tobacco industry, 420,000 deaths a year, hooking kids, represented by corporate lawyers, who developed the whole architecture of corporate bankruptcy that allows them to come back in, retention payments to executives who developed the grounds for the bankruptcy, corporate lawyers. And here's else what they've done for huge retainers. They have destroyed our freedom of contract with fine print contracts. That's lawlessness. That's complete lawlessness. And they've done it in ways where it's very hard to circumvent. This destroys any kind of negotiating power for all the consumers, at whatever capacity they are. They are systematically obstructing access to justice. For example, for millions of wrongfully injured people in our country, obstructed their right to have their day in court with a trial by jury, jury trials at a 30-year low. They're on their way to extinction. Right-wing judges pressure lawyers to settle mercilessly, as if to say, yeah, you want to come before me next time? You better get down and settle. Corporate attorneys try to split plaintiff lawyers by saying, we'll negotiate your fee apart from the settlement, putting the plaintiff lawyer in a conflict of interest with his or her own clients. The corporate crime wave has trivial budgets, law enforcement budgets. It's as if there's a street crime wave in New York City and there are 100 police for the whole city. The environmental crime section of the Department of Justice, last time I checked, didn't have more than 70 lawyers. There are corporate law firms that have 2,000 lawyers representing corporations. It's never subjected to much inquiry by the media. We have the prison industrial complex, total lawlessness in these prisons. They don't like the look of your facial expression. The warden will put you in solitary confinement. You can't appeal. That's a horrific, cruel, and unusual punishment that psychological studies are now coming forward with and trying to make a constitutional issue out of it. Corporate crime is pervasive because they get away with it. It pays. They do not have to deal with much countervailing power. The prosecuting attorneys are looking for lucrative jobs. They go from 125 or 150,000 jobs a year from the Justice Department or the SEC to $1 million a year with law firms like Cravath Swaine, Covington and Burling, et cetera. And so they're in a conflict of interest in terms of their future lucrative careers. It just goes on in one area after another. Now, to illustrate statistically the lawlessness, Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine put out a report over 2 years ago saying that the rock bottom estimate that they have come up with is that 5,000 people a week die from preventable problems in hospitals. Not clinics or doctor offices, just in hospitals. Now let that sink. 5,000 human beings. That's hospital-induced infections, hospital malpractice, understaffing, all kinds of various negligence, many of which can be prevented. But how many lawsuits? Probably not 1 or 2% of the next of kin file any lawsuits. There are a lot of obstructions to filing these lawsuits. Let's switch to, and that's not the only study. Harvard School of Public Health has put studies on medical malpractice years ago, about 2,000 a week dying from that. Level of competence, all you need is 5 to 10% of the physicians who are incompetent or incapacitated from practicing safe medicine, and you've got hundreds and hundreds of thousands of patients who can be harmed. The second is fraud in the healthcare industry. Both the Government Accountability Office and the expert on this at Harvard, Malcolm Sparrow, have said rock bottom, 10% of all healthcare expenditures are drained away by computerized billing fraud and abuse. That this year is $350 billion, of which not $10 billion is recovered by litigation or law enforcement. Medicare says that $60 billion is defrauded every year, and they recover maybe $2–3 billion. Why? Because the Department of Health and Human Services doesn't have the attorneys, the investigators. Their budgets are not adequate, even though $1 of law enforcement can bring in $15 of recovery, because Congress won't give them the budget. Congress is aiding and abetting in corporate crime. Congress is also aiding and abetting in massive tax evasion, and not just with tax loopholes or global tax havens that are permitted that Jim Henry talked about. They have cut the IRS budget by 25% since 2011, And the IRS has even more duties because of Obamacare, et cetera, than ever before. And so the IRS calmly says, we don't collect $400 billion a year, uncollected taxes, because we don't have the personnel to do it. And that's one reason why you can never get anybody on the phone at IRS. They're totally overloaded on the phone, and customer service is extremely damaged as a result. And the Republicans, they really have the blame for this in Congress, are doing it every year. And they are aiding and abetting tax evasion, not tax avoidance, tax evasion, lawlessness all over the country in this area. There are a lot of other examples, and I really don't have that much time, but I would like to point out that billing fraud is a massive problem, and we need young litigators to start practice in class actions and all kinds of litigation. They would make a ton of money in this area. In the securities area, the brokerage area, the billing of suppliers, billings, wage theft, $60 billion in wage theft, according to the Economic Policy Institute, pretty reliable think tank in this country. So what happens when you have mass lawlessness that is institutionalized? You have mass immunity, mass impunity, and you have a level of recklessness that is not adequately reported and disclosed that damages the health and safety and economic well-being of tens of millions of Americans. Even in the area of child protection, just routine child custody payments, et cetera, there is rampant violations of law. Ongoing myths about the law serve to camouflage or protect those truly dominant acts of power. That's an important reason for the near non-existent of regular compliance reports by regulatory agencies to Congress and the public. I mean, isn't the duty of a regulatory agency to tell you to what degree companies are complying with the standards, water pollution standards, air pollution standards, pesticide control standards, food safety standards? There isn't a single agency in the federal government that puts out an annual compliance report. The last one I saw was in the Labor Department years ago in wages and standards practices. Now, isn't that revealing? And one reason they'll say is we don't have the budget for it. It takes quite a bit of work to develop compliance reports that are reliable. But the other reason for it is the merry-go-round. They go into government, they go out, they get good jobs with corporations, and then they go into government at higher levels. The military budget is rife with lawlessness. How about this one? There's a federal law in 1992 went into effect. Every government department and agency has to present an auditable budget to the Government Accountability Office of the U.S. Congress. One department has violated this since 1992. It's the Defense Department. And here you have a $700 billion plus budget department a year. Over half of the entire federal government's operating expenditures is now in the Pentagon and the military-industrial complex. And they don't have an auditable budget. This is not a technical accounting matter. That is why the Pentagon admitted it could not locate and explain the loss of $9 billion in the first year of the criminal invasion of Iraq, which has killed over 1 million Iraqis and thousands of U.S. soldiers. $9 billion, they couldn't account for it. As Everett Dirksen once said, $1 billion here and $1 billion there. Pretty soon it adds up to real money. How about this? The Air Force admitted they had to buy billions of dollars of supplies because they couldn't locate these supplies in warehouses around the country and the world. There's no inventory, no budgetary control. I was just told by a high official in the Air Force, when I told him about that the Pentagon is violating federal law. And every Secretary of Defense says, we will get an audited budget, give us another 5 years. Well, they're all gone in 5 years. Isn't it funny? They say 5 years, they're all gone. And I told him about this problem, and he starts telling me stories. And one of them, he said, he was in charge of a program in the Pentagon, and the first thing he looked at were the managing manuals. There's no managing manuals, the guy told him. He said, well, what about the budget for what we're going to spend? He says, there's no budget. And so he said, well, how are we going to know what we're going to do and how to do it? And his subordinate civil servant said to him, that's right. See, institutionalized cynicism. The F-35 is now $100 million per plane. You could almost put it on this stage times 2. That is 2 times more than the auto safety budget of the Department of Transportation in the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. They have highway support budgets, driver education. But the auto safety standard, one plane, it has never flown in combat. It is vastly cost overrun. And we're trying to get other countries to buy some of it because it's breaking the bank. It'll be the first $1 trillion weapon system, the way it's going. And the government keeps buying fewer and fewer from Lockheed Martin because the price per plane is going up bigger and bigger. I hope I've given you a glimmer of systemic lawlessness, and something is not studied at our 205 law schools, which is a pretty serious indictment. What are they? High-priced trade schools? Or are they professions, building professional people? And that's one reason why people are so cynical when they see the protestations that this is a government of the law, this is a country under the rule of law, and they see it's a farce in their daily experience. They can't even use small claims courts, which are designed for consumers, and now it's controlled by creditors against consumers. And now in my state of Connecticut, for example, they charge $100 to use the small claims court. And if you win, they'll refund it. But $100 just to get into a small claims court? They're already bureaucratizing the small claims courts. So you keep saying to people, you're presumed to know the law. The judge lectures the ordinary citizen standing before the judge. You are presumed to know the law. Well, why don't they teach the rudiments of the law in high school or college? Why don't they teach us about tort law or contract law? Young people are wrongfully injured from street crime on up. Product defects. Young people have to sign these agreements, fine print agreements, or click on Facebook and so on, Instagram. It's not like it's foreign to their experience, and we don't teach it. So I think we've got to make lawlessness a political issue, an election year issue, because in a state of lawlessness, the people who have the most money, the corporations who have the most raw power are going to run the country into the ground, as they already are. Half the country's population is poor. Forget all the other statistics. Half of the country's families are told to make it under $50,000 a year gross for a family of 4. That's poor, before deductions. 2 parents, 2 children, in the land of the free and the richest land in the world. When you heard all these executive compensation figures by Steve and Bill and others, break it down in terms of hours. We're talking about the top 400 or 500 CEOs are making between $10,000 and $20,000 an hour. Some of them are making, like the head of U.S. Healthcare. This is a company that administers Medigap health insurance for AARP. Last year, he made $60 million. That's over $30,000 an hour, 8 hours a day. people in the company are making maybe 15 bucks an hour. Walmart, they're making about 10, 11 bucks an hour. The head of Walmart's making 11,000 an hour. We have to quicken the people's sense of injustice. If they don't develop a cultivated sense of injustice, other than pox on all your houses, I'll vote for anybody who says they're going to clean up the swamp. If we don't develop a cultivated sense of injustice in terms of their own lives, how they're cheated, how they're obstructed, how they're underinsured, how they're excluded in their voice, how they're put on hold, how they're underpaid, how they're disrespected, we will never have a popular movement for justice. So I want to thank you all for coming. Those of you who made the presentations, I want to thank really, and I hope you all stay in touch with one another. One of the problems we have with great fighters for justice in this country is they often don't know each other in the same field. And I hope the people who saw this on C-SPAN, and thank you C-SPAN, and real news networks out of Baltimore, will go to the website csrl.org to get the contact numbers for any of these subjects and speakers who've seen or heard today. As far as my concern with Congress to turn the country around, that's the lever, that's the fulcrum that's closest to the people. I've put 2 books out. One is called Breaking Through Power, It's Easier Than We Think, and it has a summons whereby the citizens turn the dynamic around, and instead of the senators and representatives having town meetings and choreographing what they're excluding, what they're talking about, the people reverse course, and they summon to public auditoriums their senators and representatives with clearly delineated petitions and names that are legible, address, email, occupation, profession. These senators and representatives to listen to the agenda of the people, which, contrary to red state, blue state, divide and rule strategies that are 2,000 years old, a majority of the people are together, whether they label themselves conservative or liberal, on major economic and ecological and children policies to turn this country around, for starters. And when not that many people bought that book, Breaking Through Power, I had to resort to humor. So I put out a forthcoming book. It's called How the Rats Reformed the Congress. It's a fable. But it turns out there's a huge rat infestation in Washington, D.C. Complaints are at a record high to the city government to do something about it. And Congress is no exception. And so in this fable, the rats come up from the catacombs and they get into the toilet bowls of the lawmakers. You can imagine the frenzy, the fear, the cover-up, the overreaction, and then the expose by an intrepid reporter who could have come out of Damon Runyon. And that led to huge derision, which led to huge public attention toward Congress, which is a rarity. And that led to active citizens mobilizing a realistic, strategic movement to take Congress back under the rubric of we the people instead of the rubric of Wall Street's corporate state. And I hope that you will have sufficient interest to read one or the other of the 2 books, and How the Rats Reformed the Congress can be obtained by going to ratsreformcongress.org, ratsreformcongress.org. And the website goes into great detail on how you can develop these Congress watchdog groups in every congressional district based on practical experience that we and others have had over a half a century. And so we close this conference, and this material we will try to advance in all kinds of multiple ways and amplify by those who couldn't be at the stage because they had conflicting schedules. And I want to thank all of you who watched it and who listened to it from around the country, as well as people who came here in Washington, D.C., and above all, the wonderful presentations that we've had by people who should be nationally known, who should be on National Public Radio and PBS and our public airways stations, who get the public commons for free and are trivializing it and sensationalizing it and letting the intelligence of the nation be continually suppressed under the almighty power of commercialism, corporatism, and the false ideology of market fundamentalism. And with that, we close this conference on the myths of market fundamentalism. Thank you very much.